The Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication at Arizona State University is a proud supporter of Indian Country Today. Students at Cronkite News and Gaylord College at the University of Oklahoma cover Indigenous communities together. This important work is distributed by more than 100 news organizations. This collaboration provides a much-needed boost to coverage of Native American communities nationwide. Learn more at cronkitenews.azpbs.org.
This is Indian Country Today.
Esquili, yes, thank you for joining us. I'm Patty Thalahungva. The state of Oklahoma is urging the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the landmark case McGirt versus Oklahoma. In July of last year, the U.S. Supreme Court tackled the question of whether or not Congress disestablished the Muskogee Creek Reservation in Oklahoma. They voted 5-4 to uphold the boundaries of the tribe. That meant much of eastern Oklahoma was still reservation land. Now the state is asking for that ruling to be overturned. State Attorney General John O'Connor filed the petition with the High Court, saying the ruling has led to thousands of state prisoners challenging decades' worth of convictions, many of which can't be prosecuted again. He claimed that many residents have no law enforcement to call when they are in need of help. Tribal leaders say this isn't true and point to a number of cross-jurisdiction agreements state police and tribal police have used to work together since the 1990s. Cherokee Nation Principal Chief Chuck Hoskins Jr. accused O'Connor and Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt of advancing an anti-Indian political agenda. He released a statement that read in part, "The governor has never attempted to cooperate with the tribes to protect all Oklahomans. It is perfectly clear that it has always been his intent to destroy Oklahoma's reservations and the sovereignty of Oklahoma tribes, no matter what the cost might be." International Day of Indigenous People was marked yesterday by the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who called for the end of what he says is a heinous legacy. The Secretary General recalled throughout modern history, Indigenous people have been robbed of their lands, territory, and their children. And he said there is no excuse for denying millions of Indigenous peoples worldwide self-determination and meaningful participation in all decision-making. There are more than 476 million Indigenous people living in 90 countries worldwide. Australia marked International Day of Indigenous People by taking the opportunity to demand justice for missing and murdered Aboriginal women and girls. People gathered in Perth to call for the country to address the epidemic in order to follow in the footsteps of other governments around the world. In Western Australia, 20% of missing person cases are Aboriginal people, despite them only making up 3% of the population. Many of the speakers brought attention to the tragic death of Stacey Thorne. The Aboriginal woman was pregnant when she was brutally murdered in 2007. Advocates say 14 years after her death, her murderer remains free, and they are calling for her case to be reopened. Also in Australia, the government is pledging $813 million to address disadvantages Aboriginal people face in the country. The money includes compensating thousands of mixed-race children who were taken from their families over decades. Families of the stolen generation will receive almost $280 million by 2026. It's the most expensive component of the package aimed at boosting Indigenous living standards in Australia. Pat Turner is the Indigenous Chief Executive Officer of the National Aboriginal Community Controlled Health Organization. She welcomes the compensation.
I just want to say how much this means to me personally. It is important recognition. I also know, however, that there are many survivors that have died waiting for this recognition, my mum being one of them.
They will also get additional compensation. Members of a statewide book club in Minnesota will be reading a murder mystery novel by a White Earth Ojibwe author. Marcy Rendon's book, Murder on the Red River, was selected by the One Book Minnesota group.
It's really an honor to have this book, to have a Native story chosen, and then to have it be a Native story about this land, because the whole setting is in northern Minnesota.
She says she finds the book resonates with Minnesotans in different ways. Book club members have until the end of the month to finish reading her book, and on August 31st, Rendon will participate in a statewide discussion about her book. And those are the headlines from Indian Country Today. I'm Patty Dolohungva. Coming up, today is the anniversary of the Pueblo Revolt of 1680. Chances are you don't know much about this uprising. Up next, we're going to give you a history lesson on this historic day.
And later, the rising cases of COVID-19 due to the Delta variant. We'll be right back. Virtually every public school student learns about the American Revolution, when the colonies stood up to the throne and overthrew British rule of the so-called New World. Long before that revolution, the Pueblo people staged a revolution against Spanish colonizers. The Pueblo Revolt took place on August 10, 1680. It's been called the first true American Revolution. Joining us today is Conroy Chino. He's a journalist, and his ancestors took part in that revolution. Welcome, Conroy.
Thank you, Mark.
Let's set the stage with the big story. What happened with the revolution?
Well, this is an event, as you say, preceded the American Revolution by a little more, less than 100 years, but it really was an incredible event here in this area of North America. It was an event that dislodged a European power from this section of North America. And it created monumental change and brought about, I think, altered history in this area for decades and even for centuries. And I think that it really just was an event that marked a road change in New Mexico's history. But this was a revolt against Spanish rule, which started around 1598. And it was a revolt against primarily religious suppression, but it also was a rebellion against the tyranny that was imposed on Pueblo people. And it really turned into, I think, an effort to, as I say, drive a colonial power out of this area of the country.
And of course, the story includes the complete organizing by Popé and other leaders to organize this revolution. And what I think is extraordinary in this day and time is if you look at the history of rope, the way they used rope in that revolution was basically social media.
That's true. It was perhaps an indigenous way to communicate with other tribes who were involved in the revolt. You mentioned Popé. He was this really incredible figure in the revolt. Played a key role. Was able to unify all these separate pueblos that existed at the time, well, still do, in northern New Mexico and along the Rio Grande Valley. We call them pueblos, but they each have their own distinctive name for their communities. Were separate, somewhat autonomous communities that spoke different languages, that had some common characteristics. They shared many similar rituals and ceremonies and worldview and philosophies. But Popé was able to organize and orchestrate and bring together a group of traditional leaders and religious leaders and unified them in this drive, in this effort to drive out the Spaniards. They set the date of August 10th, and as you mentioned, they sent out dried deer skin with knots on them, and each knot was to represent a day leading up to the rebellion. and each day the pueblos that were going to join in this revolt untied a knot, so that by August 10th, all the knots were untied, and that's what started the uprising and the revolt against Spanish rule.
I think one of the other extraordinary things is that the Spanish, of course, did come back. And when they did come back to the Southwest, it was really on Pueblo and indigenous terms. They had to adapt their own colonizing rather than just by fiat.
Exactly, Mark. When I mentioned the monumental change that occurred as a result of the revolt, the Spaniards did come back, and they called it a peaceful reconquer 12 years after the 1680 revolt. And what changed dramatically in that time period is that the Pueblo people were able to maintain their traditional homelands, areas that they had occupied for centuries. They were able to then restore their traditional religious practices, their ceremonies, rituals that have been carried on now even through this century. And they were also able to come to some sort of understanding with the Spaniards and the missionaries that came back, that they wanted to maintain the kind of traditional lifestyle that they had been living in this area, and also to continue to engage in their religious practices. So those have continued. In fact, the Spaniards were able to, I guess, allow for a way to for the tribes to question, or to at least a process to deal with the mistreatment that had been occurring over the decades. So what you have then is, I think, a maintaining of the sovereignty of Pueblo people, a maintaining of our culture and our language, and certainly a maintenance of our traditional homelands since the Pueblo Revolt.
At the beginning of the show, in the introduction, we talked about school children and what they know about the American Revolution. Why is it important that this be American history as much as Pueblo or indigenous history?
Well, Mark, I never learned, as I was growing up out at Acoma, which is where I'm from, I never heard about the Pueblo Revolt. I didn't learn about it until I was in college. And I'm sure that was true for many of my generations after me. And so I think it's critical and important. We learn about the American Revolution. We learn about, empires that existed in ancient Greece and the Roman Empire. But we never, our children aren't taught about the Pueblo Revolt. They're not taught about what happened, the details behind it, the figures who were involved. I mean, it wasn't just Pope. There were a number of traditional leaders, religious leaders, who united, as I mentioned, behind this effort. And so I think it's critically important for not just Pueblo children to know their history, but for indigenous children across the country, and for our non-Pueblo friends to know about this moment in history here in New Mexico, and so that you understand why not only these events occurred, but how it is that Pueblo people have then been able to maintain their culture, their language, and their traditions. And I think there's a certain amount of pride and strength in knowing what happened. The purpose of the revolt was not merely to hurt, slaughter, maim, however you want to describe it, the Spanish and the missionaries who were here, but I think it was really an event, a restorative event, to restore what Pueblo people had held on to so dearly for centuries: a lifestyle, a belief system, a set of ceremonies and rituals that they've continued to maintain over time. And I think it's important for children to know that.
And it really is extraordinary. You mentioned just a generation ago how this wasn't taught, and yet today Popeye is in the halls of Congress.
That is true. Soon after, I believe in 1980, on the tricentennial ceremony commemorating the 1680 revolt, the Pueblo Revolt. A sculptor from Acoma Pueblo here in New Mexico was commissioned to do a sculpture of Pope. There aren't a whole lot of historic descriptions of who he was, what he looked like, his height, or any other physical description of him. So I think Cliff Frawa, who was a sculptor, was allowed then a little bit of freedom to then sculpt a piece that ended up in the halls of Congress, the Statuary Hall. And I'm not exactly sure the time of when it was dedicated, but certainly I think it's up there with other commemorative figures in the Statuary Hall in Congress.
And truly an American revolutionary. I want to ask about, there's kind of an intellectual framework about decolonization. And here's a narrative that really talks about not just how decolonization worked, but how it lasted for centuries. How does that play into our understanding of the world?
Well, I think, and I'll talk from a Pueblo perspective. I think Pueblo people, because of how they view the world, they were so receptive, cooperative when Europeans first stepped foot in this country. And they welcomed them, they fed them, they clothed them, they cared for them. And in return, unfortunately, what happened was this colonization of a people who had no understanding of the idea of pledging to an entity, the royal crown, the Spanish crown at the time. So, for example, when Spaniards and the conquistadors traveled out to Acoma, they forced the leadership out there to pledge allegiance to the Spanish crown. I mean, these were concepts that I think many of the indigenous groups here in the United States, in particular here in New Mexico, just didn't understand, and unfortunately they suffered as a result of that. They were subjected to some very violent, brutal, ruthless acts at the hands of the Spanish and the missionaries who came in. So I think it's important to understand and put this in context of what has happened here in New Mexico and across the country when we talk about colonization and this whole concept of colonizing indigenous people in North America.
Is there anything else you want people to know about the Pueblo Revolt?
I think what I'd like for people to come away with in knowing about this piece of history, New Mexico history, is that, we are survivors. We've survived some of the most oppressive forms of tyranny and brutal acts. And, that happened in history, but I think we need to just focus on what's happening now and the fact that we have our traditional homelands, we have our languages, we have our culture. And I think, as I say, there's a certain amount of strength that comes from knowing that part of history and a pride that comes with it. And so that's what I want to leave people with in maybe commemorating the Pueblo Revolt, though there's nothing celebratory about that happens in the Pueblos, not unlike the 4th of July. But still, I think there's a need to know this about Pueblo people and this event that occurred 341 years ago today.
Conroy Chino, thank you.
You're welcome, Mark. Thanks for having me.
When we come back, we'll find out how tribes are dealing with the Delta variant of the coronavirus. We've been living in a pandemic for more than a year now, and just a few months ago, communities started to open up. Now, we're seeing the rise of the Delta variant, which is alarming public health officials. Kalle Benallie is a reporter and producer for Indian Country Today, and she wrote about this recently. Her story, COVID-19 Variant, Cocktail for Disaster, outlines the issues tribes now face. Welcome, Kalle.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So there was a settling down and people were pretty sure that we were coming out of this, and now all of a sudden everyone's concerned again. Maybe lay the landscape for us.
Well, I think Dean Seneca, he was a senior health scientist for the CDC for 20 years, laid it out perfectly. He said there are still about 50% of the US population who is still unvaccinated. There are rises of hospitalizations and positive cases. And he called it a cocktail for disaster, and that this month is extremely important on getting everything handled.
And it's so easy to think about Indian country as a monolith, yet there are some communities that have vaccination rates very high, 90%, and other tribes that are under 50. And that's where you get into some real issues, is it not?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been a rises in COVID-19 positive cases in Oklahoma, Nevada, the Navajo Nation. And that's really concerning that tribes need to track, and really, like the Navajo Nation President Jonathan Nez said that there needs to be a stronger mask mandate and people need to stay home.
And I think that's one important thing for viewers is that unlike a lot of communities across the country, when a mask mandate goes into effect in tribal communities, there seems to be a lot more support for it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think just everyone is so concerned on making sure that the previous 2020 numbers don't happen again, and that there aren't these very strict rules that happen again, that this can be controlled.
And part of that control, we're starting to see tribes and tribal organizations cancel events, are we not?
Mm-hmm. Well, so far, there have been events, though, Indigenous events that have been going on during the height of all this, during especially in Nevada, the Res Summit in 2021, and there will be another NIJA conference that happened in Las Vegas in this month. So that's a big concern, I know, for Victor Roca, who is I think the chairman of NIJA. And so he hopes that there will be some health regulations to go on there.
Was there any data about those conferences? Were they super spreader events, or do we know enough at this point?
No, unfortunately, we don't know enough. One thing about this variant, that's very high transmission, and this is getting a lot of people sick. And so the data, I think, is a little hard to track, but so far there's just only rumors about who has become positive.
One thing we are seeing in the data is that the high hospitalizations are almost all unvaccinated people. Does that build a renewed emphasis to get that two-step vaccination in place?
Mm-hmm. And the Navajo Nation president has been very vocal about it. I've spoken to a citizen in Oklahoma for the Potawatomi Nation, and she said that she hopes that there will be an increase of media and like commercials and social media to show tribal members who are getting vaccinated. And that's one recommendation she gives to the tribe. And Dean Seneca mentioned that they are doing as much as they could, but there does need to be an emphasis on getting a second dose.
Well, and that public education is interesting because where you're seeing some of the higher infection rates is where there's opposition to masks and other mandates from the larger society, not from tribal communities.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Dean Seneca mentioned that Oklahoma is one of the lowest states to have fully vaccinated citizens. And so and I know some of the clinics there, that 90% have native people who go there, and then other 10% are not native. So that could probably mess up with the data a little bit.
What else are you finding from this story?
just that is just a huge concern for leaders and for scientists, that we really make sure that this doesn't escalate to something worse than last year, and that there is a need to be more diligent in our communities.
What else are you working on, Kalle?
I'm just working on the Santa Fe Indian Market event that's going on next week in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and how COVID affects that. And that's all I can think of right now.
That's a pretty extraordinary challenge, because to get a crowd, you're actually inviting people that could be spreading the disease.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's one of the biggest events in Santa Fe. And so this will be interesting to see how they handle that.
Kalle Benallie, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And that's a slice of our Indigenous world. Thank you for watching. For all the latest news, go to IndianCountryToday.com. I'm Mark Trahan.
Sometimes you got to take a stand just because you know you can. Oh, you got to run, you got to run. Standing rock. This is Indian Country Today.